The Candid Frame is supported by donations by listeners just like you. Help us to bring you great conversations with great photographers. Support the show today with your monthly contribution through our Patreon effort at patreon.com/The Candid Frame, or click on the link in the show notes or the website at thecandidframe.com. Thank you.
This is Ibarionex, and this is The Candid Frame. In the small community of photographers that I'm a part of here in Southern California, I really appreciate how different they all are from me and the work that I do. Along with street photographers, I know portrait, wedding, fashion, glamour, food, and every kind of photographer that you can imagine. I not only enjoy looking at their work, but I also like that we can on occasion sit down and talk intimately about where we are with our work and our careers. It means a lot to me to be able to be open and honest about the many challenges involved with leading a creative life. David Valera is one of those photographers in my community. You may have heard his name before, as a previous guest, Ave Pildas, recommended him as a photographer you should check out at the end of his conversation with me. But even though I've known David for several years, I've never gotten around to having a proper sit-down with him. I knew that he has a career in animation and has worked on several DreamWorks films, including Kung Fu Panda, How to Train Your Dragon, and Shrek 2, and I knew that I really love his street photography. But there was a lot that I didn't know about a fellow photographer who I know loves Los Angeles as much as I do. This episode remedies that. All right, well, David, welcome to The Candid Frame. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Baronix. I'm humbled to be on your show. Been a fan of your show for quite a few years, and I was looking forward to this interview.
Oh, good. Some people are very nervous about talking with me. I don't know
I'm totally
why.
nervous about this. I hate talking about myself. It's terrible.
Well, I'll hold your hand. I've known you for a while, and Ave sort of put the bug in my ear about, you should interview David. I go, yeah, I should interview David. So I'm glad we're finally making this happen.
Yeah, it was an old buddy of mine. I grew up across the street from him. I was sort of the neighborhood rat around the neighborhood, and running around, we got into riding cycles together, road biking together.
Really?
Before I even knew he was a photographer. So walked into his house and noticed a bunch of cameras lying around and a lot of prints hanging on his wall. And that's when I realized he was one of the professors at Otis.
Is that how you got the bug to use a camera? Or?
I don't think so. I think it did reinvigorate my interest back into photography. I was still maybe 13 or 12 or 13 at the time, but I think my mom kind of planted that seed in me a while ago. She sort of inherited her camera from her brother when she moved from the Philippines here to the United States, and it was a Leica 3F, and so that was the camera that we just brought on vacations with us, and I sort of took over those photography duties just because I liked taking pictures, and none of it was fantastic, but that was sort of what started the photography bug in me. And then she bought a Polaroid, and I loved using those Polaroid cameras and expending as much film as possible. And they were silly expensive, and they're really expensive now. And but I think it was a little Kodak Instamatic 44 that had those little square cubes,
I remember
the flash
those.
cubes.
You're dating yourself, brother.
Yeah, I'm old. I'm old. I'm of that generation. But I just loved expending, I just like flashing my sisters, blinding them with the light. And then I like the look of how those cubes looked after they were expended. They were all bubbly and distorted.
Yeah, I would keep those.
Yeah. They were like in my bag of marbles too, just because they looked super cool. But I'd say my mom kind of instilled the photography bug in me. And then, completely dropped out of it for a few years, as we do, and then got back into photography for my high school yearbook, and then dropped that again when I went to college for a few years, and got into other interests like sports and girls, as people do.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I had my first child that I got back into photography, because I wanted to capture every waking moment of her. My first digital camera was that Apple QuickTake 150.
Oh my God! Yeah.
Yeah, and it was I think it was 1 megapixel or something silly like that. If that. Yeah. And it wasn't fast enough to capture her, so I went back to my old film cameras, my Nikon FE2, and decided this was kind of a pain to photograph her in film, and I actually ponied up the money to buy my first digital SLR, which was a Canon 20D, which was silly expensive for its capabilities, but I'd say that camera was the camera that really got me going back into photography and getting my mind into it more and more.
Yeah, and having the child is a big inspiration for a lot of people to get reintroduced to photography. I think sometimes I feel like half of the people that I talk to tell me the same sort of story, that they put it aside because they were interested in high school or college, but it's the introduction of a new family member that all of a sudden they go, oh, let me pick this up, and then that blossoms into something more. So how did you move from initially wanting to photograph your family to doing something more creative? Because your work, which we'll talk about, is along another creative line. But how did that sort of translate into wanting to do something more with the camera?
Well, as you get sort of tired of taking photos of your own kids and your family, other people start looking at your work and go, hey, can you take photos of my family? And so I started doing some client work and doing some stills for mostly child photography and family photography. But I'd say when I got more into the genre of street photography, which I didn't really know what it was at the time, but in 2007, my wife and I we're planning a trip to Istanbul, and I picked up a book from Alex Webb, his Istanbul book, and I said, hey, we're going there. I want to take pictures just like this. And
which is really easy.
Didn't happen. It was, but it was what sort of informed me that there was a certain type of travel photography that was more human based, and it really gave you the feel and the culture of the place you're visiting. So I took my 20D and a big long lens, and we headed out to a small town just west of Turkey, a tiny town called Sirinci. And I saw this lady just crossing the street on this cobblestone pathway, and the light was just setting behind her, so she was beautifully rim-lit, and not knowing any of the rules or the laws surrounding photography in Istanbul, the visions of being sent to a Turkish prison and Midnight Express, and I was really, really nervous. My heart was pounding, and I lifted up, but I said, I have to take this photograph. And I lifted up my camera, and I walked towards her a little bit, but still fairly distant, and I took the shot. And I only took one shot, and I felt really embarrassed, but she didn't even see me. And I walked back across the street to where my wife was at the market. And when we got back home, I found that was the one photograph, that I wanted to take a look at, because it really was my first attempt at street photography, and with the intention of shooting a stranger out in the wild, out in the streets. And I looked at the photo. It's not very good. I think I shot it at like maybe 150 or 200 millimeter lens, and so it's all sort of depth of fielded out. The bokeh was just there, but I got the shot. but it's nothing that what I would consider a good street photograph by today's standards.
It's interesting about those moments, because I think everybody has them, when you see something that you just know will make a good photograph, and that it comes against that wall of fear and anxiety. And at some point, it's amazing when you are inspired so much that you're willing to move past that fear to do it, even if it's not completely successful in terms of a photograph. I think it's incredibly successful as an artist to be able to have that experience and get to the point where you can repeat it, because that fear and anxiety never goes away. I've been doing this forever. It's always there. Yeah. But it's the practice of being able to go, okay, I'm feeling this, but I'm still going to do this and try to do it as well as I can.
Oh, it's still there. I mean, it's one of the things that I think photography has helped me is, I have a lot of anxiety. I have a pretty high stress job. I have 2 teenage girls at home, but I've always been a kid with high anxiety. I would have been classified as an ADD kid. My parents would have jacked me up on Ritalin if there was such a thing back in my day. I used to get in trouble a lot, with the law, and I was in the principal's office. And when I grew up, when it was time for me to go to high school, I had 2 choices. My father laid down the law. He said, you're either going to military school or you're going to an all-boys Catholic school. So, I think the Gulf War was just about to start, and I was like, I don't want to go to war. I'd be of age to be sent overseas. So I don't know if I picked the lesser of the 2 evils, but I ended up in all-boys Catholic school. But that which, talk about fear, growing religion. I'm not going to go there, but the anxiety of photography and shooting a stranger, you're right. It's always there. It's always there for me. And sometimes it takes, a walk around the block to get back into the cadence of, this is what I'm doing and this is what I gotta, and after the first few exposures, then I get my head into it. It becomes sort of like a game for me, and I start getting my head into it and concentrating on the little rectangle and what I'm going to fit in that little rectangle.
Yeah, I always appreciate the first couple of shots of the day, because that greases the wheels for me. As soon as I've got that underneath my belt, regardless of whether or not it's a great photograph or not, it's just like I just go with the momentum that builds to the point where it's just like, it's not necessarily rote, but it's just that I know what to do in order to get me to where I need to go, and that the feelings are sort of just suppressed or quieted for a while, or at least long enough for me to be able to make the photographs.
It's kind of like your stretch exercises before you play your game. You're warming up. You have to have that warm up period. It's really hard for me to completely switch it on and just go hard, all balls out into it instantaneously. It does take me 5 or 10 minutes to definitely get used to what I'm doing, get used to approaching strangers out on the street, mm-hmm. like in downtown LA where I do a lot of my photography. But yeah, it is those first few frames that helps you get started.
Mm-hmm. You grew up primarily in Silverlake?
Yeah, my parents still live in the house that I grew up in.
Okay.
It's certainly changed since when I was there.
Yeah. But tell me about, growing up in a city and being familiar with it, especially when you eventually start photographing it. I know that you were big on bicycling, as you said before, around town, and I think it's sort of an interesting way of sort of exploring and discovering a city, regardless of whether or not you have the intention of photographing it. But tell me what your relationship to Los Angeles was sort of growing up, and how that might have influenced how you eventually sought to document it with a camera.
Well, Silverlake, when I was growing up, was definitely mid-city grit and grime. It wasn't sort of the trendy coffee houses and boutiques that it is today. It was basically a little suburb just in East Hollywood. And I would jump on my bike. My parents both worked the swing shift, so they would pick me up from school about 2:30, 3 o'clock, and they'd go to work, I'd jump on my bike, and I'd just take off. And I would head down to Sunset Blvd on my bike through a bunch of gangs and prostitutes in Hollywood and drug dealers. And I was always interested in all the club goers going into Bill Gazzari's at the time, the Roxy, and it was all hair bands that were playing in these venues. But I was always interested in seeing all the ladies with gigantic hair and the guys with leather, and just walking in there, and I would just kind of hang out and watch them, because I wasn't of age to actually walk into any of these venues. But it was sort of my idea of entertainment. That was my TV. And also coming back and riding my bike through all the different neighborhoods, I just was fascinated by people and by the urban landscape that Hollywood and Silverlake had to offer. And so I always thought, I wish I had a camera with me at the time, because there were so many amazing scenes that I could have documented that I just remember. And I think that's part of why photography is interesting to me, because it's those missed opportunities. At least I have the memory of them, but if I had a physical print of what I saw, it would have been pretty amazing. I would have been pretty happy right now having a collection of those sort of experiences. But LA at the time was, for me, just, I didn't know any better. I just thought everybody grew up like this and had these sort of childhood experiences living in the city or the urban environment. And when I told my wife what I used to do as a kid, she was like, "That's wild. That's unbelievable." When I was your age, my friends and I would go out in our backyard. She grew up in Cleveland, and they would play in the forest and, capture little tadpoles and things like that. And I always thought that's strange to me. I mean, it's so different than what my urban upbringing was. You
mentioned that your mom was from the Philippines. Was your dad as well?
Yes. My dad's from a province called Abra, which is up in the mountains.
So how was it for you to be the son of two immigrants? And you're like the first generation.
Yes.
And the whole sort of being tied to different worlds. Mm-hmm. The one world being the world of the Filipino culture, and then being the American son and all that stuff that entailed.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just talking to somebody about that, because I have 4 older sisters, and we don't really know much about the Filipino culture. We've had my mother cooked Filipino food, so we always knew what the food was all about. But in terms of the culture, the dances, the language, they never spoke to us in Filipino. My mom came to the United States to go to college for nursing. She went to DePaul University, and my dad immigrated here, and he went to Cal Poly Pomona to study agriculture. And I think at the time, it was the early 60s, I guess, they had a really difficult time assimilating to the American culture. It was like sort of this, the greaser culture for my dad. He was always into cars and leather jackets and Ray-Ban Wayfarers. But I think they made the concerted effort when they had children that when we were born here, we were Americans. They wanted to raise us as American children. So, which was good and bad. I think it's good, because I think I'm fully American. I speak the language, but I do miss out on some of the cultural aspects. I think I did miss out on the flavor of the language and sort of what it means to be a Filipino. I only know what it means to be an American. My family in the East Coast, they're very, very closely tied with the culture. And so when I go back there, I'm learning and more about it when I visit them. They all live in Connecticut and New Jersey and New York. So I think I'm slowly later on in life getting to know what it means to be a Filipino.
Yeah. I mean, I'm the son of 2 immigrants, and that whole thing of straddling two worlds about within the confines of my family, my extended family that was out here, speaking Spanish, eating certain foods, the whole dynamic of how men and women relate and all that stuff. And then on the other hand, being in basically an American school, an American neighborhood, and how I felt I fit in and didn't fit in, and how I related to other people. So much informed who I became. And sometimes I think that is part and parcel of why I see things and respond to them in the way that I do. So I was just wondering whether or not you feel any semblance of that.
Oh, totally. It's very similar. The high school I ended up going is up in the foothills of Southern California in a very affluent neighborhood. And I felt a little different than everybody else. When I look back at my experience in high school, all my friends were Caucasian. A lot of they were blonde. But I didn't see myself as different unless I was in certain situations, and then I felt a little like, oh, you know what? I am different than you guys. There weren't very many Asians that went to this high school. It was a very small high school, and there weren't very. It wasn't a very diverse sort of high school, and there were situations. I always played sports, so I always felt included into the friendships and the team and the community. But I think it wasn't until later on in high school when we would have these high school dances, and our sister school was there. I was, and the girls, I think, saw me. I was different, which was, it worked in my case sometimes, and it didn't. But I felt that I fit, but I didn't fit in a way, which is really hard to describe. But my experiences in high school were mostly positive, but I did have those instances where I did feel a little different than everybody else.
Yeah. Because when I think about especially the genre of street photography, historically it's been a field that's sort of dominated by a white male of a certain class level. And I think that informs a lot of the imagery, including how people of color are captured and rendered in a lot of photographs. And it's not that I'm conscious of that every time that I go and shoot, but I think I'm sensitive to it. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering how it is for you as a street photographer, particularly when you're shooting in areas where there is a range of diversity in terms of people, of race and ethnicity. How do you consider your photographs when it comes to that? I know you're not necessarily going out with the intentionality, in the intention of doing something with that particular idea in mind, but I wonder how you think of your own photographs in comparison to the works of others because of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Like you said, when I go out to shoot street photography, I have an open eye and sort of an open heart to everything. I just take things as it comes. I don't expect anything from it. Sometimes I come home with absolutely no good photographs. Other times I may have one or two that I'd want to post online, but I don't know. I may be more sensitive to people of color and how I want to represent them on the street in my photographs. But I don't know if that's just done subconsciously, but it's certainly not an intention. I never want to take a photograph with the intention of showing people in a negative light. I may have some humor going on in my photographs, but I don't go out to. I want to show more of a positive thing about humanity and about the human condition. There's so much negativity in this world, but in terms of how I want to represent ethnicity, that's a good question. I never really thought of that, but historically, when you look back at all the great street photographers, it is sort of represented by a strong Caucasian sort of socioeconomic group of people. And I think a lot of the collectives out there, people of color aren't fully represented or there's an even distribution of ethnicity within certain collectives and groups. I think that's something that will hopefully change, because I think people of different backgrounds have a lot more interesting things to say than what we've constantly been bombarded with for the last few decades. And you know, there's a lot of diverse individuals that I see online that have an amazing eye and amazing vision because of their background and their take on society and their biases.
It's one of the things that I really like about living in the age that we do, because we have access to photographers from Asia, from South America, from Africa, and it's like you get to see what other street photographers are doing, and it's really fascinating to see how similarly and how differently that they see it. That it's not just this sort of homogenic tradition that we have to sort of get inspired from. What was the catalyst that really allowed you to feel like you have made a leap in terms of what you were trying to do with street photography? Because a lot of people go out, they shoot in the street, they don't necessarily know what they're doing, they're sort of hit and miss. But did you have a moment where you felt like, I'm getting this? And what was it? And what was the inspiration to inspire that?
I've for years and years, I just took really bad photographs. And, when you look back at Lightroom's great when you scroll back into the history of the early photographs that you've taken. I don't think it was until I met the street photography community here in Los Angeles, which is, it's interesting in itself, but I was able to show some of my photographs to others that I respected and get their feedback on some of my work. And I start realizing maybe I need to head down this direction and close off this other sort of route that I was headed down. And just having them and their feedback and their critiques on my own work, I think, helped me get to another level that I was comfortable to show more of my work and to show a certain side of me. And that's when I started feeling like, okay, this is I'm starting to achieve some of the work that I've always wanted to, based on other photographers that I followed earlier in life. And I think it was not until Todd Takayama started a studio in downtown Los Angeles, a simple studio where we all sort of congregated and met, and we really built a pretty good community in downtown Los Angeles or Los Angeles. A lot of people were coming from different parts of town and getting to meet sort of your peers and getting to see what their interpretation and their take on sort of the art form and what they see on the same streets at the same time with the same lighting. It was really interesting to see sort of their take and their style as we're standing on the same street corner. But it was, they are, when I say the street photography community in Los Angeles is interesting, LA is just a weird place to begin with, just because it's, we're all used to sitting in our cars and we go from our garage in our house and we drive down the freeways or the highway to our parking garage at work. And there is no sort of interaction with people in general, not like what you would do in, say, San Francisco, having to commute on the BART or the Muni, or even in, New York, for instance, on the subways. In LA, I think we're so insular. Mm-hmm. And I think what lacks in our community, in the street photography community, is that there's nothing that really kind of binds us. We actually have to search out to be part of a community and be active and make an effort to meet up one or two or three different people in the city, where in most cities you just kind of like, hey, I'm only like a 10-minute train ride away.
Or you just bump into them on the street.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is happening more and more, I have to say, in downtown LA. There's a lot more street photographers nowadays than there were when I first started.
We're like roaches now.
Yeah. I mean, you trip on them every block. They're on every street corner, which is good. It's fine. It's just, it's just much more prevalent and more popular in terms of it's so easily accessible nowadays, and everyone's doing it. It seems, but in general, it's good, and I'm finding more and more interesting people that way. Yeah, LA is just it's a hard place to. You have to make the concerted effort to find people with the same interest and to build a bond and friendship with.
Well, tell me about your work at here at DreamWorks. What is it that you do?
I'm the head of final layout. What we do is we block the character and cameras, almost like previs or moving storyboards, and we're seen as the cinematographers / cameramen / set dressers of the pipeline. We kind of set down the blueprint before it enters the more expensive production departments like animation, facial animation, lighting, effects. So we kind of inform the rest of production where we're staging our shots, where we're shooting, so the modelers aren't putting so much work in an area that the audience or nobody is ever going to see. So it's a cost-saving technique for the production, but it's also, I think, one of the more creative aspects of animation, because we're very involved with the story process with the directors. And at the end of the day, we're trying to give the viewers what the director's intention is. We're trying to hit all the story points that he wants to hit in a very aesthetically pleasing way.
Mm-hmm. And you serve as the role of a cinematographer, even though we're talking about animation. Mm-hmm. How has cinematography informed your street photography and vice versa? Oh,
that's really interesting, because they're looking at other examples. Roger Deakins is actually a cinematographer that we have consulting on some of our films. He was very active in How to Train Your Dragon. And I was reading an interview with him about him when he was filming Sicario. And he used Alex Webb as a strong influence and a strong example of how he shot that film. In terms of shadows and the colors being used. But he said something to the effect of he couldn't shoot the entire film that way because it would just be overwhelming to the audience of how complex the layers are in those photographs. And I kind of see it the same way with the work that I do here influences the work that I do on my own personal work in street photography. A lot of it is a little bit too clean, I think, for street photography. I really work on the composition, and I hate Dutch angles, so I always kind of clean that up. But I'm learning to let things go and be a little bit more organic in my work now, and vice versa. Street photography has influenced the work that I do here at DreamWorks. I was working on a film called Larrikins that just recently got canceled, unfortunately. But the way I actually got that job was because our department head liked my street photography, and there was a lot of street photography sort of influences that he wanted to infuse in the storytelling and sort of the compositions that we were shooting in certain story points of the movie. So they kind of worked back and forth between my personal work and the work I do professionally.
I think it's interesting because you were showing me some of the examples of your work and the work of others, and the idea that in when you're creating an animation, you have to be in complete ownership of every little bit of frame that passes through passes in front of a person's eyes, and the idea that you're very conscious of not just the subject, but the background and the foreground element and the relationship between all of those elements, and making a conscious decision to emphasize one thing or de-emphasize another, sometimes to make when you can get away with making a more complex image and where you have to go for starkness and simplicity. So I'm wondering how being sort of immersed in that all the time for your work here sort of influences how you approach something when you're out on the street.
It's such an incredible contrast. Here we could be in endless meetings about the simplest things that the audience would assume, like depth of field, like how are we going to isolate our subjects, or do we want to isolate our subjects? What do we want the depth of field to look like? Do we want character to it? Do we want it to look like it's shot within this anamorphic lens? We go through endless meetings to make the smallest decisions, and then when I'm out on the street, it's just, how do I feel? Do I want to shoot this at an F11 or an F8 or F13 or 16? It's a very simple, organic thing. So I think what helps me out on the street, I feel like I have full control over what I'm doing from the very, very beginning to the very end. What I do professionally, it's a collaborative sort of agreement that we have with multiple department heads, trying to figure out and help the director execute his vision. And at the end of the day, it's what he wants, and you're sort of executing what he wants. Whereas in street photography, it's just me. And so, I'm the client and I'm the vendor at the end of the day when I'm doing street photography. And I think that's why I enjoy it so much, because it's such a contrast from my day-to-day life. Not only am I trying to execute the director's vision, but I'm also trying to appease my producer. Like, the director says, I want to do this, and then I have to go back to the producer and say, well, it's going to take me X amount of man weeks to achieve this look. So there's a lot of back and forth trying to appease both parties. Of course, the producer wants to do it as quickly as possible, as cheap as possible, but the director wants to put as much as he can to tell his story. So there's a huge tug of war that I'm sort of caught in the middle of. But when I'm out on the street, it's just this huge release of, I don't really have to please anybody but myself. Yeah. And it's awesome. I mean, and it's very meditative. It's very relaxing to me. But because I always have this need to fill a frame, to compose a shot. I can't drive my car without looking out the window and go, oh, how would I stick a rectangle around that? Or, oh, that lighting is so amazing, I'm going to stop the car and pull my camera out of my bag, and which I do more often now than I used to, which seems like such an effort, because I'm always late to everything in LA, because you can never know what the traffic's going to be like. But yeah, it's a huge contrast between my own personal work doing street and doing animation. Everything is planned out in excruciating detail, and we could be in production from 2 to 4 years, depending on the complexity of the film.
Wow, that's a big commitment.
Yeah, it is.
Well, street photography is much less.
It is. It is.
Which is one of the nice things about it. I mean, you can go out for 15 minutes and and feel like satisfied. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily have to be like hours and hours.
Right.
I find that I spend much less time on the street now than I used to. I mean, I used to be like 4 hours out there, and about 2 hours, hour and a half, I'm like, I'm good.
Yeah.
Just because I think I've refined the way that I've seen to the point that I know what I want, or I know what I want when I see it, rather than just sort of constantly throwing the line out, seeing what I can catch.
Yeah.
Is that your experience?
I definitely feel the same way. I shoot a lot less in terms of hours walked and frames expended in my camera, because you do develop your eye. You do develop exactly what you want to filter out in your own head, and it's just the days of me going, hey, I'm going to spend 4 hours walking downtown LA, I don't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. My life is so busy with 2 teenage girls. Really, the only time I kind of shoot street photography mostly now is take them shopping. They want to go shopping. They're in the mall or they're in some store off La Brea, and I say, I'm going to walk around the block for about 15 minutes. I'll meet you back here. Mm-hmm. And I go and I take a few snaps, and I come back and meet them, and they make me pay for their purchases. So that's basically how most of my photography is done. But I do make some weekends where I say, you know what, I need to clear my head. I need to walk for at least a couple hours. I'll be back. And I just go downtown and, do the same circle that most everybody here does, walk down Broadway, maybe make my way up to the financial district, or maybe head south to Santee Alley if I want something a little bit more diverse and ethnic. But by the end of the day, it's just, I think you're right. I probably shoot less, but I think I'm more effective. I think I get more keepers than I did when I just said, hey, I'm walking all day long and I'm going to shoot like 100, 200 frames. I think you just become more efficient at it just because with experience what you want and what you want to achieve.
We were talking earlier about photo books, which we both have a very strong affinity for. As much as I like looking at pictures online, nothing matches being able to sit in a comfortable chair and just turning a page slowly involving books. And I know that you and Dana and I think Rinzi sometimes get together and just like share books.
Yeah, we trade books.
Yeah, let's talk about first the importance of books to you, and also about getting together with those two and exchanging books and what that provides you.
Yeah, well, first off, photography books are incredibly expensive. Yeah. So, trading books for a month or two with your friends is a great way to expand your library. You get to see a lot more for a lot less. But I think black and white photography, yes, you could look at most photography images online for sure. But when it comes to color photography, I like to see what the original intention from the photographer, what he liked in those greens and yellows and blues and reds. When you look at things online, whether you're on Firefox or Chrome or Safari, all the color profiles they could be night and day. They could be so off. So I think photo books informs you of what the original intention the photographer meant. This is exactly how I wanted to process the film, or this is what I wanted the greens to look like if they were very actively a part of producing the book and the prints. But there's something also about having something tangible in your hand. I love those Sunday early afternoons that I just sit in my couch or my comfy chair under a window and flip through somebody's monogram. It's just there's something pleasing and interesting and comfortable about having a great photography book on your lap and flipping through the images. It's very inspiring and it's very motivating to see those images in a tangible way rather than sitting in front of your computer and clicking through next photo. I spend probably 5 times longer on an image with a book than I do online. Online, I think we're just conditioned to, almost flip through images as quick as we can click that button. But where you have something heavy like a book spine and a paper to turn, there's a little bit more effort involved, and you almost want to spend a little bit more time with it.
Are there certain books that are your go-to books that you return to over and over again?
Oh, I love Alex Webb's Suffering Light, even though none of my work looks like his, but I'm just inspired by the way he sees how complex his images are. I went to Aperture Gallery in New York last year to see, it was the very final weeks of his La Calle exhibition, and to actually see those images in large format printed out, it makes the book look insignificant in comparison because the colors on his prints were just mind-blowing. But I'd say Suffering Light is a great photo book that I always go back and look at. Trent Parks for Black and White, Minutes to Midnight, and The Black Rose are truly inspiring. Just reading the passages of sort of his thought process and why he made certain images kind of really resonates with me and inspires me. Those two guys, I'd say, are amazing. If you haven't picked up any of their books, those are what really kind of get my juices going when it comes to photography.
Yeah, one of One of my secrets I learned while I was at school was up in Berkeley was Moe's Bookstore. And I think a good number of my initial collection of photo books came from that store because they have extensive used. Mm-hmm. And I would go in there every week and see what came in. And they still sell stuff online. But for me, it's just like, I'll take it used because spending $100 or more on a book that's a commitment.
Oh, yeah. So it's much silly. It is a commitment. Sometimes it's worth it. Like I spent some money on Saul Leiter's collection. His color work is just, and how abstract and the way he sees things through, what I love about his work. It's always, it's done in New York with those, he likes to shoot through windows with frost or mist or condensation, and it makes things look so abstract. We rarely get any sort of like weather or condensation on our windows here unless it rains, which it kind of did this year. But I think I'm attracted to things that I know I can't capture here in LA. You just look at, I'm amazed by Saul's work. He had a gallery showing at the Rose Gallery. I think it was maybe 3 years ago. It was a few months right before he passed away. Mm-hmm. And to see his prints on the wall and at that size was mind-blowing as well. It was truly amazing. And I just wished I bought one of those pieces because they seemed so so affordable in comparison to what they are worth nowadays, for sure. But I love going to that gallery. She represents some of the best photographers in the business.
Yeah. Well, my last question that I ask each guest is that I ask them to recommend another photographer for our listeners to discover and explore, and it can be anyone, someone you've long admired or someone you've recently discovered. So who would that one photographer be and why?
Well, I actually have two. Ruben Ratting, I'm actually a fan of his work. He's a New York photographer, does a lot of photographs of people in Brooklyn and in New York. He knows how to fill the frame. He's starting to use flash a little bit for some of his sort of interior shots. I think his work's really interesting, and I met up with him last year for the first time, and our personalities are kind of similar. We ride on the same sort of wavelength, and we have very strong opinions about similar opinions about certain things and certain individuals and certain photography. And then I just recently had a workshop last weekend up in San Francisco, and I took a workshop with, I think it was, forgive me if I mispronounced her name, but I think it's Yolanda Mazur, and her work is totally different than anything that I would ever shoot. She's very graphic. I think she has a graphic arts background, and she looks at colors and lines and very, very strong compositions and graphic compositions. I enjoy her work tremendously.
Awesome. Well, David, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks about it, Enix. It was fun. Thanks.
Thanks again for joining me, and thanks to David for joining us on The Candid Frame. To find out more about David's work, visit davidvalera.com. Thank you for your continued support of The Candid Frame. If you haven't already, please take the time today to write a review in the iTunes Store. Your ratings and comments help people to discover the great conversations that we offer here at TCF. You can also support the show by making a monthly contribution through Patreon. Visit patreon.com/The Candid Frame, or you'll find a link in the show notes and the Candid Frame website. Or if you just want to make a one-time contribution to the show, you can do so via PayPal by clicking on the donate button on the Candid Frame website or the show notes. Thanks to Robert Williams for his recent contribution. Thank you so much. It means a lot. To access our complete archive of interviews, download the free Candid Frame app, available for Apple iOS, Android, and Windows. It's the fastest and most convenient way to hear and save any of the great interviews we present here at TCF. Links for each can be found in the show notes and the website at thecandidframe.com. The Candid Frame's audio engineer is Martin Taylor, who you can find at theothermartintaylor.com. The show's senior producer is Cynthia Parker, and our music is from Kevin MacLeod, whose royalty-free music can be found at incompetech.com. And you can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at simply @EbadianX. And this is EbadianX, and this is The Candid Frame.